Welcome, guys. Today you're going to take your notes on your own and then move straight into your podcast as soon as you're done so you can move at your own pace. When we left off, we had been talking about land at the very end. I said you needed to write down this kind of land ordinance piece. And this area in here is partly what we're going to be talking about today. This Old Northwest, it's called, and how valuable that was and how people were really insightful about how they decided to deal with this area. And as a result, allowed us to make progress and move forward. The Articles of Confederation, America's first Constitution. The Articles of Confederation, some have said, were more like the Articles of Confusion. They provided for a loose confederation in some cases. Some people describe them as a firm league of friendship, but 13 independent states were linked together for joint action in dealing with common problems, like foreign affairs. A really clumsy Congress was to be the chief agency of the government. There was no executive branch. King George III had left a real bad taste in people's mouths, and the vital judicial arm was left almost exclusively to the states. Congress, though dominant, was severely hobbled. Each state had a single vote, so that some 68,000 Rhode Islanders had the same voice as more than 10 times that many Virginians. All bills dealing with subjects of importance required the support of 9 states. Any amendment of the Articles themselves required unanimous ratification. Unanimity was almost impossible, and this meant the amendment process, perhaps fortunately, was really unworkable at the time. If it had been workable, the Republic might have struggled along with patched-up Articles of Confederation rather than replace it with a far more effective Constitution. Congress was weak and was purposely designed to be weak. Really suspicious states having just won control over taxation and commerce from Britain had no desire to yield any of their new power to an American parliament, even one of their own making. This kind of reminds me of what I was just asking you to read about last week, where if people feel like their power is in jeopardy, they can grow really skeptical and cynical and cling to things that might not even be what they're verbalizing morally about what they want. They're fearful of losing power. 2 handicaps that crippled Congress were that it didn't have power to regulate trade. States were making up their own rules, making their own laws with regards to this, and Congress couldn't regulate it. The states were free to establish different, often conflicting laws regarding tariffs and navigation. Perhaps more importantly, Congress couldn't enforce its tax collection program. It had established a tax quota for the states, but then asked them to kind of contribute their share on a voluntary basis. The central authority, a government by supplication, basically asking them to volunteer, allowed for them to collect about 1/4 of what it actually requested. The feeble national government in Philadelphia could advise and advocate and appeal, but in dealing with the independent states, it couldn't really command or coerce or control. It could not act directly upon the individual citizens of a state. It couldn't even protect itself against really gross indignities. In 1783, a group of mutinous Pennsylvania soldiers whose pay was in arrears marched to Philadelphia and made a threatening demonstration in front of Independence Hall, and after Congress appealed in vain to the state for protection, its members fled to safety at Princeton College in New Jersey. The new Congress, with all its paper powers, was less effective than the old Continental Congress, which had wielded no constitutional powers whatsoever. However, As weak as it was, it did prove to be a landmark in government. In spite of its defects, the anemic Articles of Confederation was a significant stepping stone toward the present Constitution. It did clearly outline the general powers that were going to be exercised by the central government, such as making treaties and establishing a postal service. As the first written constitution of the Republic, the Articles kept alive this kind of ideal of union and held the states together until such time that they were finally ready to establish a strong constitution by peaceful evolutionary methods. Without this intermediary step, it's possible the states would have never had consented to this kind of leap from the old style to the new. This is Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and this lithograph is what it looked like in 1776. So it was originally built in 1730s. It was a meeting place for the Pennsylvania Colonial Assembly, and this building witnessed a lot of history. Washington was given command of the Continental Army here. The Declaration of Independence was signed, and the Constitution was hammered out. The building began to be called Independence Hall in the 1820s, and today is a major tourist destination in Philadelphia. Last slide is going to be about landmarks and land laws and how much foresight people had at the time in dealing with these kind of new territories. I'm going to jump ahead because this picture is supposed to be going away. Okay, there we go. Landmarks and land laws. Handcuffed though the Congress of the Confederation was, it did succeed in passing really far-sighted pieces of legislation, and these related to the immense part of the public domain that had been recently acquired from the states and commonly was called the Old Northwest. The area of this land lay northwest of the Ohio River, east of the Mississippi, and south of the Great Lakes. And I'm going to go back and show you that map just one more time. But all this land, actually this map isn't perfect, but this area was ceded by states. Remember, we talked about 6 or 7 states having land holdings and about half not having land holdings, and how some states ceded this to the new central government so that they could sell it off and pay debt. So this new kind of public domain land that had been acquired from states, now they had to figure out, so what are we going to do with this massive new territory, really? The first of the laws that were passed was the Land Ordinance of 1785. Okay, I got to make that go away. That's not going to work. There we go. So the first of these laws provided the acreage of the Old Northwest was to be sold, and the proceeds should be used to help pay off the national debt. The vast area was to be surveyed before it was sold and before it was settled. So it was forestalling this kind of endless confusion and lawsuits. In other parts of the new United States, they won't be applying these same sort of process and standards, and there's going to be all kinds of confusion and all kinds of people speculating and lots of problems associated with not having these kinds of processes in place. So what they were to do was divide the land into townships of 6 miles square. In fact, I'm going to show you a quick visual while I tell you about this. So what was to happen is that each township was to be 6 miles square. Each of those were to be split into 36 sections of 1 square mile each. The 16th section of the township was to be set aside to be sold for the benefit of public schools. This is a really important part of the legislation. It's a priceless gift to education in the Northwest. The orderly settlement of the Northwest Territory, where land was methodically kind of surveyed and titles duly recorded, really contrasted sharply with the chaos south of the Ohio River, where uncertain ownership was the norm and fraud was really rampant. Even more noteworthy was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Which related to the governing of the Old Northwest. This law came to grips with the problem of how a nation is going to deal with its colonies, the same problem that had bedeviled the king and parliament in London. The solution provided by the Northwest Ordinance was a judicious compromise. First, there would be two evolutionary kind of territorial stages during which the area would be subordinate to the federal government. Then, when a territory could boast 60,000 people, it might be admitted by Congress as a state, with all the privileges of the original 13 charter members. This is precisely what the Continental Congress had promised the states when they surrendered their lands in 1781. The ordinance also forbade slavery in the Old Northwest, which was really path breaking. It exempted slaves that were already present there. That became a problem. And it didn't address, later on there's going to be kind of these nuances. What happens if somebody travels from the South and brings their slaves with them? Then what? That becomes a problem. But the bottom line is it starts this process of, how do new states get added to the Union? The wisdom of Congress in handling this really explosive problem really deserves warm praise. If it had attempted to chain the new territories in permanent kind of subordination, a second American Revolution could have erupted. Fought this time between the West against the East, possibly, or, eventually what will happen, of course, is battles between the North and the South. But we could have had problems even earlier. Congress thus neatly solved the seemingly insoluble problem of empire. The scheme worked so well that these basic principles were ultimately carried over from the Old Northwest to other frontier areas. So, in a nutshell, you have new territory that's been gained. You got new territory that was gained. You have it being sold off to pay debt. You have a surveying process, to organize that land and to, have it deeded. You set up a process for kind of infrastructure inside of those towns. You set up an opportunity for new territories to become states of the Union, and you've dealt with this long-standing issue of slavery that's going to continue to be an issue for a number of years, 100 more years, and some people say further. Okay, thank you very much.